My background is I spent 25 years in the Royal Australian Air Force as what then was termed as a facilities officer. Nowadays they're called airfield engineers. And then about 18 and a half years ago, I got out of the Air Force on the Friday, walked back in on the Monday, called the Air Commodore Fred instead of Sir, and then started to develop the governance processes for the then Defence Estate Organisation. The Infrastructure Division is what the Defence Estate Organisation was rebadged as, and we're a pretty lean machine. We have about 4 branches. We have one which is a state planning, where when somebody's got a twinkle in the eye on how we're going to support new weapons platforms, come up with base redevelopments and the like, they look at all that from a strategic perspective to determine whether the process should proceed, whether maybe an IT solution, or maybe it's just a daydream. And if they come up with a facility solution, it's then passed to the branch I'm in, which is Capital Facilities and Infrastructure branch. And we actually do the delivery of all capital facilities above about $2 million. We have another branch, the State Engineering branch, and State Engineering and Environment branch. They produce all our engineering policies where we apply the BCA, but because of the stuff that we actually build, there may be unique defence requirements. So they look at engineering policy in that regard as well. We also have a very strong environmental focus. We look at how do we actually drive green building requirements and the like. Believe it or not, Defence is a very environmentally friendly organisation. You can look at some of the bases that we have, or even weapons ranges. We take things like old cattle stations and turn them into pristine bush again, believe it or not. The other branch we have is in the state management, where we actually do the acquisition, disposal, and management of leases, not only in Australia, but overseas. We're pretty lean. There's probably about 400 people in that. And the branch that I'm in actually does the delivery of the construction. We have about 80 people driving our delivery of our projects. But what is it we actually manage? Defence Estates, we have probably the largest property owners in Australia. As you can see there, we have 397 owned properties with 72 significant bases. 50% of them are out there in regional Australia. We have 20% in outer suburban and inner regional. We've got a few hectares of land, 3 million of it. 25,000 buildings. That's just a bit of a headache when you're starting to look at the FM side of the business. So we have pretty significant estate. That gives you an idea of where the major bases are around Australia. We actually have stuff overseas. For example, we have Air Force and Army in Malaysia on Air Base Butterworth as part of the 5-Power Defence Agreement. You're probably aware we got diggers in Afghanistan operating out of Karen Tauk. We have other parts in the Middle East, and we also do support in the Pacific Islands. That gives you an idea of what we're actually managing. $18.2 billion worth of on the balance sheet. And then when you look at we try to replace that, 60-odd billion. Our current budget is around $1 billion on capital facilities. Last year, I think we spent about $1.2 billion. The year before that, $1.5 billion. We're a repeat buyer. We're in this for the long term. Our average 5-year program is in the order of about $7.5 billion on capital facilities. And as you can see there on the FM side, I've got the figure 450 million. I understand this financial year, that's now up to 0.5 billion that we're actually spending on estate maintenance. Type of facilities we have in that 25,000 odd facilities, it varies. There's a lot of stuff unique to defence, and there again, when you look at a military headquarters, sounds important, just an office block. Airfields, we have our own airfields, plus we have joint user airfields. For example, RAF Townsville, we operate with a civil airport, and it's primarily civil operations. You go to Darwin, that's a military airfield, but it's predominantly used by civilian. We have ports, we've got our own harbours. We've got Garden Island in the middle of Sydney, and then there's another Garden Island over in West Australia. Training areas and firing ranges, they vary around the countryside. We have, for example, the Bradshaw Field training area in the Northern Territory. Probably if you looked at the size of that, it'd probably be about a quarter of Victoria. So we have quite a bit of real estate there to play with. Storage facilities vary from warehouses through to explosive ordnance facilities. We have our own research laboratories, Defence Science and Technology Organisation. They're based in Melbourne and also in South Australia and other parts of the country. We have communications intelligence installations, workshops and maintenance facilities. All our weapons platforms need to be maintained. We run our own schools and, of course, office accommodation. You go up to Canberra and look at the Russell Offices complex. Got quite significant office accommodation up there. Residential accommodation is a mixture of barrack blocks and the like that we build ourselves. We've currently got a major project called Single Leap. It's a living environment accommodation precinct, which is a PPP. And of course, recreational facilities. I'll get these buttons right yet. So where does BIM fit into all this? Probably about 18 months ago, I couldn't even spell BIM. My division head walked in and he said, I've just heard there's something called BIM. He said, find out what it's all about and let's see what we can do. At the same time, Buildingsmart was working with BEIC, I think that stood for the Built Environment Industry Innovation Council, and they were working with the government and looking at how to progress issues in the construction industry. And when you start to look at the stuff, for example, that Buildingsmart came up with, on improving productivity in the construction industry is 6 to 9%. Part of my job is to use Defence's purchasing power to drive change in the industry. So when we looked at that, and then there's all this, I don't know whether it's BIM wash or not, and we get told these stories that we can save 10% on capital cost by implementing BIM. And when you look at the size of our budget of over $1 billion, and I can get 10% saving, that's a significant saving to the taxpayer, and also other ways that we can enhance what we're actually doing within defence. The other interesting figure that's thrown at us is 30% we're saving on your FM side. I don't know where these figures come from. I still haven't been able to find the benchmarks. But if it's really good, then BIM is something we should be into. So we bit the bullet and we started to look at research on BIM. Because the size of that budget I've just explained here, we're about 90% of Commonwealth's expenditure in capital facilities. So they look to Defence to lead the implementation of BIM in the Commonwealth. As Sumit said, our suite of contracts has also been adopted by the Department of Finance. They're the other major builders in the Commonwealth. And if I can actually bring in BIM into our suite of contracts, it'll all be piggybacked on by the other Commonwealth agencies, I believe. We also look at the opportunity to improve our current procurement and governance processes for Defence estate management. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in a minute. But once again, it's that key thing, maximise the opportunities for cost savings. we've been doing is looking at the application of BIM is what's happening overseas. We've heard of what's happened with the GSA, and it's interesting to note that the feedback we were getting last year that the GSA in the States, the big driver for them was looking at the FM applications. That was a big driver for us. And yet I'm not too sure that that's really happening over there. I think we had discussions last night looking at what was happening in the States, and I'm not that convinced that the FM side, the same as in Australia, has really got the oomph going at the moment in regard to the application of BIM. So we're looking at what's happening overseas, looking at what's happening in North America, what's happening in Europe, particularly in the UK, and what's happening in Asia. We're also looking at what's the maturity of the industry in the application of BIM. It's interesting when you come to conferences like this and listen to where people are heading, and I sometimes get a bit cynical as to where we hear people are, and we hear all this push. But when you actually get to hit the rubber hits the road, I sometimes wonder where we're actually getting what's actually been promised. And I think that's come out in a couple of the presentations today as well. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff there that is actually happening. It's given me the opportunity, I think, to look at our actual design and delivery processes. And I'll talk about that shortly as well. We have our own suite of contracts. Our contracts were developed back in 1992 when the then government made the decision that they get rid of the old Commonwealth Department of Works and we would outsource the delivery of construction. So in defence, we looked at that and said, well, what are we actually going to do? We decided to take a blank sheet of paper and have a look at risk allocation and the like, and we came up with our own suite of contracts. I'll talk about that shortly as well. But I think that was 22 years ago. I did a review back in 2002, and I think now with the advent of BIM, I'm going to have the opportunity to revisit the lessons learned over the last 11 years and look at the next generation of contracts. We've also got to look at scales of entitlement and standard requirements. I see the opportunity with the introduction of BIM that we can actually start to standardise. And that's not only on things like living in accommodation for single diggers. We can look at how do we actually apply that for office environments and all the rest of it, and come up with modular construction and come up with a consistency around the place, rather than each time we go to build something, we reinvent the wheel. So tied in with that, what I've got to look at is a pilot project to really get this started. We've gone around the edges looking at BIM, and indeed, as part of our research, when we go out and talk to industry, they say, oh, we're already BIMing that. And then you say, well, what are you BIMing? And we find that particularly, as has also been pointed out today, that the design industry, they've been using 3D for what, 10, 15 years. But did they tell you they're doing that? No, you've got to ask. This is where I find it peculiar when they say clients should be getting involved. But this works two ways. Industry has to tell us as the clients what are actually happening. How are we going to get educated? So how do I set up a pilot project? As I say, it's a very difficult slide to read, but what that is, if you actually go on the internet and Google our infrastructure management website, you'll find about 95% of our governance processes freely available on the internet. And what that slide there is our actual governance processes. That's the front sheet. And if you click on each of those, it will take you into more and more detail of how we actually do our business. And what I'm doing now is taking the opportunity to have a look at our traditional processes and then look at it through the eyes of BIM and say, can we get smarter? Can we change the way we're actually doing business? So I'm taking the opportunity now to take a blank sheet of paper and really revamp how we do business. That's the whiteboard in my office. Everybody says, why don't clients do BIM? That's a good idea. I just go and order one, don't I? We start to look at it and say, where will we head? And you can see where, see those, I think we discussed those a couple of times today. That's us trying to work out where do we head here. It's not a simple exercise. Some days we sit there and we work on this and we say, this is easy, we'll just modify the contract, she'll be right. And the next day, we have another think about it. Now, have you ever tried to manage infinity? That's what I sometimes think the implementation of BIM is all about. So where are we heading? Our development to date, I'm a member of the Interdepartmental Working Group, headed up by I think the longest acronym in government agencies, DISTRA, Innovation, Industry, Science, Research and Tertiary Education. There's representatives on that committee from Defence, DISTRA itself, Department of Finance and Department of, I got a mental blank, Infrastructure. And we're currently looking at, the light of that Baird report, the Buildingsmart recommendations on how we're actually going to progress BIM from a Commonwealth perspective. The Buildingsmart Report, we've gone into that in detail, lots of good information in there. That's actually been presented to government. Senator Lundy's looked at it, and I'm sure you've probably heard John Mitchell talk in the past on his discussions with Senator Lundy in regard to how we're actually going to progress the Buildingsmart Report. I'm on the board headed up by Tom Fussell, looking at the working groups of Buildingsmart as well. I'm also on the Standards Australia Committee looking at BIM. So we're getting involved there on how we can actually progress all this. I also spend a lot of time engaging with industry, dealing with designers, the constructors. But I'm trying to find the FM industry. They all seem to be living in a vacuum somewhere. And very difficult to engage with. When dealing with MEP side, that's easy. They'll come and talk to me, but this big saver, 30% in FM, but where are they? Maybe somebody will tell me one day. And of course, we've got to get the lawyers involved. We talk about contracts. As I say, what I'm looking at is how am I going to progress contracts. I've been working pretty closely with Clayton Utz on how we progress that. I've actually got a couple of draft contracts on my desk from a BIM perspective, and I'll talk about that shortly as well. So we are working our way through, hopefully no longer infinity. From a strategic planning perspective, we've got to look at it from a client perspective. How do we actually master plan all those properties I was showing you before, all those bases, when we look at what our existing conditions are, when we're bringing a new weapons platform in. That could be a simple thing, you might think, but let's say we bring in a new type of army truck. That's okay, you just park a truck over there and she'll be right. Not necessarily. We maintain our own vehicles. That means we might need to have to rework our workshops. You have to look at the axle loadings on the trucks. How do we actually train people to drive those trucks? So we actually build our own areas, for example at Puckapunyal, to do driver training. So a simple thing like bringing a new truck into play has an impact on our real estate. So we have to master plan and try and look ahead 20 years on where we're heading. The introduction of a new aircraft, for example, the new air combat fighter. You've got to look at noise. What's the impact coming off an airfield? We then have to look at the noise profile. What's the impact? Is there an impact on the community? And all the rest of it. So that's all part of that forward planning that we have to get involved in. And I say that's part of the BIM equation. that we start right up front to put all that and start to visualize it, digitize it, and get ready to progress towards design. I'm working closely with our colleagues in Defence on GIS, on Geospatial Information Systems. We see that's integral as well to the implementation of BIM. We've been a few of the VANSI conferences. I don't know whether everybody's aware of VANSI. That's Virtual Australia, New Zealand, looking at how do we actually capture from a geospatial area data on town planning and the like, capture where the engineering services are in the community and all the rest of it. We are looking at doing that in our own way for all of our bases. We've got to look at data. And that's what I focus on, the I part of BIM. It's information. As a property owner, what sort of data is it we require? I'm a great believer in, I've got a problem, and I know what the answer is. I look to the industry to actually fill in that void between the question and the answer. Then what happens to that data? We've just had a look at the last presentation on the Adelaide Hospital. Look at all the data that was going into the actual construction of that. How much of that, as a property owner, do I really need? And that's where I see the engagement with the FM industry, is they need to tell me what data is they need coming out of the model so that we can actually manage the real estate for the next 20 to 30 years. We're having difficulties trying to get the answer to that particular question. Plus, and I'm probably the one to blame, when we did untying, we also untied for the management of FM. And believe it or not, back in those days, we didn't really have the capacity to hold the data for all our plant and equipment and property. So we outsourced that to the actual FM provider. But of course, when you change the FM provider, there's a transition of data. And we seem to be reinventing the wheel about every 5 to 7 years as we renew the contracts. So what we're now looking at is bringing all that back in-house. And how do we do that? And we're looking at set up our own servers and all the rest of it. Now, for the implementation of BIM, and we're building a new facility, that should be reasonably easy because we're going to get this outflow of data. But very rarely you hear anybody talk about what I call retrospective BIM. That 25,000 existing assets I've already got, we still have to manage. How do we get the BIM-type data onto that sort of stuff? So that's another issue I believe we need to focus on as well. And particularly when you look at the maintenance of your mechanical plant and the like, how do we gather all that and where do we hold it? So tied into that is the governance processes, current and future. As I said, I've shown you how our current processes are. I've now got to look at how do we rework all that. As I said, we've got to run suite of contracts. We looked at, back in the early 90s, what contracts were available. If you're as old as me, you probably remember things like NPWC3 and the like, which I believe is still being used in the Northern Territory. And we looked at the risk allocation, and we looked at it from a principles perspective. So our contracts don't really look like an AS2124 or the like. We have our own risk allocation. Back in 2002, when I reviewed the contracts and came up with it, I amalgamated what was then traditional head contract, D&C, and Dock&C into one contract. So we now have a head contract that even has design clauses in it. And people say, wait a minute, this is a traditional head contract. And the trick is that the contract particulars actually drive the construct of the contract. Switch off clauses, switch them on, and the like. So I've effectively come up with a head contract that can be used for 3 different design delivery methodologies. We've heard talk today as well about managing contractor. Defence invented the original managing contractor back in 1992. When I reviewed the contracts in 2002, I came up with what Len Lease described today as the 2-stage managing contract to contract. The diagram that was shown on that particular slide is similar to what Defence does, but we actually leave the managing contractor to do the full design. So it's a different model again as to what was illustrated to you earlier today. So we have a two-stage managing contractor contract. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. We also introduced our own standalone design services contract, which backs to that head contract. DIP stands for Defence Infrastructure Panel. We have our own panel of about 22 different disciplines. Predominantly, the big one, or not predominantly, the big one is project management, but we cover a variety of disciplines to make it easier for us to procure when we require specialist support. We have medium works contract, which is similar to the head contract 2003, but a softer risk allocation. We use that for projects up to 15 million. We have a minor works contract to deal with the small SMEs out there, and that's for projects up to about 2 million. Very, very soft risk allocation, but it works. We have our own FM contracts. We're currently being tender evaluations to look at the introduction of new FM providers nationally. We provide our own documentation for registrations of interest and tender, and then behind that is a whole pile of collateral documents. But even to make it simpler for our own people and for industry, we have various manuals. Each contract has about 6 manuals to support it. We have it written in English, and because we've got engineers, we have flowcharts to make it easier. And all that is freely available on the internet, on that site I showed you before. Sumit, when he spoke to me about coming to talk today, raised the issue of security payment and reckoned that from an MEP subcontractor perspective, you might be interested in how we approach that. When we introduced the managing contractor contract back in 1992, that was post things like the Giles Royal Commission in New South Wales, where there was a look at how did we actually progress security of payment for subbies. This was all pre-security of payment legislation, and we looked at it and said, how could we best progress this? And what the mechanism we came up with was, in case of managing contractor contract, we pay the managing contractor their off-site overheads and profits as one fee. We pay them another fee to actually manage the delivery of the project, but we don't pay them for the subbies. What we actually do is make them the trustee in a trust account, and the only beneficiaries in that trust account are the subbies. So we put in a mechanism to protect the subbies and enhance the cash flow. When we looked at that, depending on how the grubby subbie was treated, it could be 3 to 6 months before the cash actually flowed from us presenting the check to the subbie. By putting it through the trust account, we guaranteed payment within 30 days. We have retained that trust account mechanism in the managing contractor contracts, even though the security payment legislation has come in. The joys of a federation is we looked at security payment legislation. It started off in New South Wales and then gradually spread around the states and territories. The most draconian is probably Queensland, with a 5-day payment from once the payment schedule is issued. So we have standardized that across all our contracts. So even though we've still got the trust account, we pay into the trust account 10 days after we receive the payment claim from the managing contractor. So we endeavour as much as possible to get that cash flow going, because we can see the benefits to the subcontract industry, and because we're reducing the overheads of managing that cost, hopefully, and we think we found that, it was actually bringing down the cost of our subcontract packages. Integrated project delivery. Another thing that comes up in BIM, and everybody talks about integrated project delivery, but in our research, we haven't found a true IPD contract. Everyone seems to use traditional head contracts, slightly modified. We're still trying to work out how it's modified. So what I'm looking at is, do we introduce our own forms of contract to do IPD? And I think the answer is yes. But to start off with, I look at our managing contractor contract. It's currently, as I say, a two-stage contract. And what are the deliverables we ask from the managing contractor contract? We ask them to produce a design. As part of the first stage in the contract, what we're looking at is trying to get cost certainty against the design for us to be able to take the project to the Public Works Committee. Any project above $15 million, we need to take through the Public Works Committee process. So we need cost confidence at that stage. And what we're looking at is cost confidence of plus or minus 10%. So the managing contractor has to deliver us cost certainty. To do that, they've got to do the design. So we get 3D. They've also got to come up with a program, 4D, and the target cost, 5D. I can see already from a BIM perspective, when we start to talk dimensions, the managing contractor contract lends itself very well to that delivery methodology. The big issue we're looking at from the 360-degree cycle is how do we get the FM providers in there? The fact that we do have our own team FM contractors, because we look after the total cycle, we have allowed for the FM contractors to be contracted and brought in at design stage so that they can look at the maintainability issues as well as the managing contractor looking at buildability. So I can see that's another mechanism we can get in at developing the model by using the FM provider. Currently at the moment, the missing link in working up to that cost certainty to go to the Public Works Committee is we don't have the subcontractors in there. The MEP subbies, I believe, are the keys to this as well. And what I'm currently looking at is how we bring in the subbies in a two-stage contract. To bring them in the design stage, to put the smarts as well of where the MEP side is coming. And that's where I see BIM MEPOS is a great tool to be able to drive that. So what that's leading me to is a new form of contract. But to do that, we've got to look at what's our expectations from industry. They need to understand our requirements. They need to understand defence's standards and conditions. As I say, we have our own engineering policy which modifies to a certain extent the requirements of the BCA to bring it, let's say, a higher standard. We have our own legislative obligations. We work for the government. We've got legislation to abide by, particularly the PwC Act. We've got to look at the fact we've got clearly compliant goods and services being provided, and that we've got competent tradesmen actually constructing that so that we can gain the necessary certification when we're handed the keys. What we're looking at is a collaborative environment. We need to be alerted early if there are going to be difficulties in delivering projects. We want to work together. So we're looking at professional standards, keep on emphasizing collaboration. That's one of the aspects I looked at when I introduced the managing contract to contract 2 phase back in 2003. At that stage, I charged the lawyers with how do we bring this in. Industry was pushing me to do partnering, to do alliancing, but when you look at that, for example, in partnering, you've got to come up with a partnering charter. And if we signed off on a charter, what was then the impact on the general conditions of contract? What was the order of precedence? So I said, if all this really works, why don't we pluck the I's out of partnering, out of alliancing, we'll embed it in the contract, and I'll call it collaborative contracting. That seems to have kicked on ever since, and the word collaborative appears all the time. So I think we took the lead initially in collaborative contracting, and we want to continue with that. The contract's there, the contract's a tool. It'll be used, but believe it or not, since we introduced our suite of contracts in 1992, we haven't had any litigation. People say, yes, because your contracts are draconian. We're a repeat buyer. We seem to work well with industry, so I don't believe that it's that draconian at all. So we've also got to look at the maturity in the industry on the application of BIM. And I think the indications today is the industry is getting mature, but it's only at the Tier 1 builder stage. Where's the Tier 2 builders? The major MEP subbies are in there, but how do we drive the whole of industry to bring this together? So, what's the way ahead? I'm looking at the Capital Solution Infrastructure suite of contracts. It's time to do a review and look at how do we progress this, particularly from a BIM perspective. How do I come up with integrated project delivery contracts? And I think I'll have two models, of the managing contractor model and a pure IPD quasi-head contract. It'll be, I think, finally we'll go for a traditional, not traditional, but a lump sum contract for the second phase, but we work very, very collaboratively in the actual design development with the designer, the head contractor, and the major subbies, and the FM provider to lead up to what I'd like to see is an LOD 400 design and then start construction. Real virtual construction before we actually start. Maybe I'm daydreaming. Sometimes I'm told I am, but that's my vision. And I'll keep on harping on about FM. We need greater whole-of-life coordination between construction and the FM contractors. I think I agree with that. We might have solved my infinity problem in regard to BIM. Thanks very much.